So it seems one of the most talked about films of the year so far is the recent low-budget horror film, Obsession. It's become a surprise box office hit and sparked a ton of discussion online. But does it actually live up to the hype? I think so, and here's why. When I first watched Obsession, I walked away really impressed. For me, it definitely doesn't reach the heights of certain modern horror masterpieces like Get Out or Hereditary. I honestly think it's one good to great twist away from being on that next level for me, but even as it stands, I definitely already consider it a future modern horror classic. The One Wish Willow immediately felt like it could be iconic, Nikki feels like she'll be iconic, and Bear is one of the more unique and memorable horror villains we've gotten in a long time. One thing I especially loved is how the film flips the roles you'd normally expect. The creepy, possessed woman who would typically be the horror villain is actually the victim, while the timid, reluctant male protagonist actually plays the role of the true villain. I also love a good title recontextualization, and I think the title Obsession has a really clever one. On the surface, it's referring to the possessed version of Nikki's obsession with Bear, but underneath that, it's really a story about Bear's obsession with Nikki. Beyond that, I think the film does a really strong job of exploring things like infatuation, codependent and abusive relationships, nice guy culture, and ideas surrounding sexual assault and bodily autonomy. And as I was watching, I noticed a lot of really interesting symbolism and small details that I think reinforce these themes even further. Now, I'm not saying every single one of these insights I found were 100% intentional by the filmmaker, but whether they were or not, they're details that really stood out to me and made the underlying story even more interesting, because I truly believe that great stories with the great foundation will eventually start to tell themselves. I think the opening scene actually reveals a lot and quietly sets up much of the story to come. The film opens with Bear rehearsing a confession to Nikki, telling her how he feels. But only after he finishes, we realize he isn't talking to Nikki at all. It's just a random girl standing in her place while he practices. That feels like a subtle nod to what will happen later when Bear once again will talk to Nikki, except it won't really be her. It's just someone or something standing in her place. The scene also establishes one of the film's biggest ideas, how if Bear had simply worked up the courage to tell the real Nikki how he felt, regardless of her response, he probably could have avoided everything that follows. Whether she said yes or no, at least he'd have his answer and be able to move forward. But Bear can't do that, as his fatal flaw is his passivity and fear of vulnerability. Throughout the film, he just really refuses to ever put himself out there first, and even after Nikki's under the wish's spell, he still waits for her to admit she likes him before he feels safe expressing his own feelings. I also like the characterization of Bear as someone who rehearses conversations beforehand, whether it's confessing his feelings or later practicing how to tell Nikki she can't cook the cat. It's a small detail that reinforces both his fatal flaw of fear and passivity, having to over-prepare for a confrontation, and also just shows the stakes on how much this moment matters to him. And honestly, what Bear needed at the beginning of this movie definitely wasn't Nikki or any relationship for that matter. What he needed was therapy. But what I couldn't help but think based on this opening was that if therapy wasn't available, he probably could have really used Nathan Fielder in to show the rehearsal. Ironically, I think a lot of lives might have been saved if Nathan had been helping Bear at the diner instead of Ian. There's also another line in this scene that really stood out to me. During his rehearsal, Bear tells placeholder Nikki
that I would choose you over everything.
And later, his wish becomes that Nikki loves him more than anything in the world. In other words, that she chooses him over everything. I think the film is suggesting that while lines like this might sound romantic, they're actually rooted in something more unhealthy. Taken to the extreme, they become codependency and the loss of your own identity. Before we even know much about Bear, the opening is already hinting that his idea of love is flawed, and his wish isn't based on genuine love, it's based on obsession. He wants Nikki to love him the same way he loves her, but the truth is, he doesn't love her. He's infatuated with her. And that's exactly how the wish manifests. I also found the reaction to Bear's rehearsal really interesting. The girl tells him she liked it, while Ian immediately says he hated it. I think that says a lot about certain male friendships and the way that vulnerability can be treated as embarrassing or weak. And what's also interesting is that Bear chooses to trust Ian's opinion over the woman's. Plus, she's even the one who suggests buying Nikki a gift, but Ian immediately shuts the idea down and tells her to leave. And you could argue that if Bear had simply just listened to her, given Nikki the gift, and never kept it for himself, almost everything that follows could have been avoided. It's funny how on my first watch I was pretty neutral on Ian, but after rewatching it, that completely changed. Obviously, he's nowhere near Bear's level, but I really don't think he's a good friend at all. On repeat viewings, there's a surprising amount of unspoken tension and history between Ian and Bear that I think is written really well. Ian's disgust at the thought of Bear and Nikki getting together becomes much more telling after learning he and Nikki had been secretly hooking up. And looking back, even his suggestion to call her Freaky Nikki feels almost like subtle self-sabotage, which he does a couple times in the film. Side note, I also really like the irony that Freaky Nikki ends up being a pretty fitting nickname for the creepy possessed version of Nikki later in the film. But there's also another bit of irony in this first scene. Ian is basically telling Bear that if he wants Nikki, he needs to stop being himself. And later, the reverse happens. In order for Nikki to be with Bear, she literally won't be herself anymore, as she's this new entity. I found that to be a cool metaphor of showing how unhealthy relationships or the pursuit of one can often pressure people into performing and losing their own identity just to attract or maintain someone's affection. And this opening scene ends with Ian telling Bear,
All you have is time.
but of course, we quickly learn that's not true. Nikki has already put in her 2 weeks, meaning Bear actually has very little time to tell her how he feels, but the line becomes even darker in hindsight because we know where Bear's story ends. Right after Ian says it, the film cuts to Bear's dead cat, Sandy, lying on the floor of his apartment. It's an early symbolic warning that Bear doesn't have much time left after all. Death is already waiting around the corner, not just for him, but eventually for his entire friend group. And the moment Bear makes that wish, the countdown truly begins. The death of Bear's cat, Sandy, and the cat symbolism in general feels incredibly important. It's probably the most recurring symbol in the entire film, and I found it really interesting. On the most obvious level, Sandy represents Bear and his fate, foreshadowing that Bear actually has very little time left, as even the exact way Sandy dies is significant. The cat accidentally gets into Bear's pills and overdoses, which is ultimately how Bear dies as well. Both of them end up dead on the floor of the same apartment. So at its clearest, I think the cat symbolizes death, a doomed fate, and running out of time. But I do also think the cat comes to represent something else, which becomes clear as the story goes on. After finding Sandy dead, one of the first things Bear does is start looking through Nikki's Instagram. And now I'm not saying that any Instagram stalking is the worst, most incel thing in the world, but I do think it's a nice way of subtly highlighting how normalized certain forms of obsession and infatuation have become. More importantly though, I think this is the first hint of what the cat may symbolize beyond death in the film. Whenever Bear is hurting, he looks to Nikki to comfort him. Here, it's scrolling through her photos after his cat died. And earlier at the diner, he says she was there for him after his grandma died, sitting with him on the phone in silence. And so it's kinda like she's becoming the thing he turns to for comfort and emotional regulation, which could feel like Bear is replacing the role his pet once filled with Nikki. And I think that's an important distinction because what Bear ultimately wants isn't an equal relationship, just someone who exists to soothe him. There's also a really great visual in this scene. Bear's bedroom is almost completely dark and the only light comes from Nikki's photos on his phone and then later from her phone call. I'm pretty confident that's intentional because the film repeatedly plays with light and darkness, especially in relation to Nikki. Before the wish, she's consistently portrayed as a source of light, most likely because even in Bear's darkest moments, she's the only hope or light he believes he has. I also think this scene continues establishing Bear's passivity well. Instead of calling Nikki for support while he's grieving, he settles for looking at pictures of her as he's too passive to reach out himself. This is consistent as Bear even says she was the one who called him after his grandma died, and later when they're on the car ride home together, she tells him,
You know you can always call me when it does.
It seems it's always Nikki taking the initiative as she's even the one to call him here. Also, I'm pretty sure he never even tells her his cat died and she just has to hear it from Sarah. And so by this point, I think the film is making it pretty clear that Bear is never going to be the one to put himself out there, even if Nikki practically lobs him the perfect opportunity. There's also another detail here that I really liked. During their phone call, Nikki tells Bear that they're running out of time, directly contrasting Ian's earlier claim that Bear has all the time in the world. And as she says it, Bear looks up at a ticking red cat clock. Again, the cat ties back to death and time running out, not just for Bear, but eventually for Nikki as well. And the fact that the clock is red also feels intentional. Red is one of the film's most recurring colors, and in movies it's often associated with either love and passion or violence and aggression. But here, I think it represents both. Throughout the story, those two ideas become inseparable, and it's that combination that ultimately drives the film towards its tragic ending. When Bear goes to the shop to buy Nikki the necklace, the film continues planting a lot of interesting details that become much more meaningful later. The first thing that stood out to me was the mirror behind the store clerk. When Bear approaches her, we see a blurred reflection of his face, and this shot is later mirrored at the end of the film when Bear returns to the store, except this time the reflection is clear. We see his face covered in blood, frantic, and completely broken. I think that contrast represents how Bear's true character is still unclear at the beginning of the film, not only to us as the audience, but even to Bear himself. I don't think the film is saying that Bear suddenly became a bad person because of the wish. I think the person we see at the end of the film was always there, but just hidden behind his own perception and illusion as this meek, good person. That blurred reflection can represent that uncertainty or even the mask that he wears. At this point, Bear can still convince himself that he's a kind and harmless person, but by the end, he and the audience have no choice but to clearly see who he really is. And then when Bear is told about the necklaces, the means behind them also feel very intentional. The store clerk highlights two in particular: the amethyst necklace, which represents calmness and clarity, and the rose quartz necklace, which represents attracting love. At first, I thought these represented the difference between what Bear wants versus what Bear actually needs in the film. Bear wants to attract love, that's why the One Wish Willow appeals to him, but what he really needs is the confidence and clarity to be vulnerable and honestly express his feelings. But the store clerk did highlight these crystals as good energies, and further thinking about it, I think that these necklaces are just what Bear should have bought, as they both could just be what he needed in like a healthy way. And what's interesting is that these necklaces also seem to represent what Nikki wants. Later in the car, she talks about wanting more love in her life and also wanting more direction. So these necklaces honestly feel like the perfect gifts for both of them. But Bear dismisses them, thinking Nikki wouldn't want them, and I think this is another example of how Ian's influence from the opening scene is still affecting him. Instead of trusting his own instincts or considering what Nikki actually needs, he continues following someone else's idea of what will make him desirable. But I definitely also have to mention the third and final necklace that the store clerk mentions, the citrine necklace, which she describes as sunshine and a rock. That specific wording really stood out to me. When you think of sunshine, you think of something bright, warm, and alive, but when you pair it with the word rock, it suddenly feels trapped, cold, and lifeless. And I think that phrase perfectly foreshadows Nikki's fate. Earlier I mentioned how Nikki is symbolized as a source of light, especially for Bear, but after the wish, that light becomes trapped inside something else. Bear essentially traps the sunshine inside the rock, as her light is trapped inside her body, being controlled by something darker. And it's interesting that right after hearing about that necklace, Bear says Nikki would hate that, almost as if the film is hinting at how much Nikki will hate the fate that Bear eventually forces upon her, a fate so horrible that she will later beg him just to kill her to put an end to it. But instead of choosing any of these necklaces, Bear's attention shifts to the One Wish Willow sitting across the room. I noticed that the One Wish Willow is surrounded by other objects like voodoo dolls, a chromoscope, and a magic eye illusion, and I think those objects are interesting because they all connect ideas of control and perception. A voodoo doll represents controlling someone without their knowledge. Meanwhile, the chromoscope and magic eye are both connected to seeing things differently or revealing something hidden. To me, that feels like a perfect setup for Bear's relationship with Nikki after the wish. He gets what he thinks he wants, but it's ultimately just an illusion. He isn't really with Nikki, he's with a version of her that exists because of the wish. Plus, it can also tie into how our perception of Bear changes throughout the movie. At the beginning, he's presented as the awkward, harmless, nice guy, but as more information is revealed, that perception completely changes, just like the blurred mirror becoming clear later. And the director, Curry Barker, has said that the One Wish Willow itself isn't necessarily cursed, but rather it's Bear's wish that's cursed, and I think that's a really interesting distinction. However, even if the willow itself isn't a guaranteed monkey paw, I don't think it comes from anywhere good. The biggest clue for me is the price, $6.99. It feels like a subtle play on 666, a number commonly associated with evil or demonic imagery, and while some people may use the One Wish Willow without horrible consequences, the idea that an object allows someone to alter fate or force a desired outcome feels inherently dangerous and like a trap being set, where most people's wishes will more likely come with some sort of catch. The One Wish Willow also continues the film's red and cat symbolisms. On the red packaging, there's an image of a red cat, as the product appears to be connected to a brand called Tabby Cat. And so the item that ultimately leads to everyone's downfall is literally tied to the same imagery that represents death and time running out, along with love and violence in the film. And finally, when Bear asks the store clerk if people complain because the One Wish Willow ruins their lives, she responds,
"Or they die, I wish they were dead."
Which by the end of the film is exactly what happens. Bear dies and Nikki reaches a point where she wishes she was dead. One of the biggest discussions surrounding obsession is whether Nikki was actually interested in Bear at the beginning of the film. So while analyzing the trivia night and their car ride home, I really tried to pay attention to every little expression and interaction between them to figure out if there was a clear answer. But honestly, the more I looked into it, the harder it became to tell. I would lean one way during one scene, only to completely change my mind after seeing another. And my confusion made a lot of sense after learning the filmmakers actually shot scenes where Nikki was more open to Bear, and then scenes where she wasn't interested in him at all. And then combining both of of those versions into the final cut. Personally, I think that was a really interesting and clever choice. Considering how terrible Bear becomes throughout the film, part of me wants to personally believe that there was never anything there, that even the One Wish Willow's tagline, "Amaze your friends," is just a dark twisted hint that Bear was ultimately trying to use this on someone who's only ever his friend. Side note, that tagline becomes even more disturbing considering what happens to all of his friends after he uses the One Wish Willow. But whether Nikki liked Bear or was even open to the possibility of something more, I think the film intentionally leaves ambiguous and unanswered. And honestly, I think that's more interesting than giving us a definitive answer, because that uncertainty puts us directly into Bear's perspective. Just like Bear, the audience is left trying to interpret every little interaction early on and searching for a sign of something that may or may not be there. And the most important line for me with this is when Nikki tells Bear in the car,
"When I have a crush on a guy, no one knows."
as I think this is also meant to be directed at the audience, that we'd never know for sure and it's left open-ended. But I completely understand why some people firmly believe Nikki was never interested in him, especially because of some moments later in the film that make me personally lean more toward that interpretation as well. And I'll discuss those exact moments later in the video. But looking closer at the trivia night itself, there are also some more hints here about Ian and Nikki's relationship. Ian interrupts Bear and Nikki's conversation, aware of just how horrible the timing is, pretty blatantly sabotaging. And later, when Ian and Nikki walk away, we see Nikki grab Ian's hat, which is a pretty classic sign of playful flirting. Another detail I found interesting is that Bear names their trivia team Team Sandy after his cat. When Sarah questions why, he tells her that Sandy died. And later, we see that every member of Team Sandy ends up dying by the end of the film except Nikki, who still receives a fate arguably worse than death. Once again, the cat symbolism connecting back to death and doomed fates. There's also an interesting framing choice when Sarah comforts Bear after learning about Sandy. She's standing in the same place where Nikki was previously framed, almost suggesting that Sarah was always there for Bear in the same way that he claimed that Nikki was. She cared about him, supported him, and was willing to be there for him, but Bear is completely unable to see it because of his obsession with Nikki. She's also positioned on his left side, which we know becomes significant later in the film. Another piece of cat symbolism that I thought was interesting, even if it might be a bit of a reach, is Nikki's moment with the homeless woman outside of the bar. In storytelling, there's a common technique called Save the Cat, where a character does something kind or compassionate early on to show their true nature. And I think it's interesting that Nikki gets a Save the Cat moment, while Bear essentially gets the opposite. He essentially gets a Kill the Cat moment, as Sandy's death is caused by Bear leaving his pills out. And I think that contrast foreshadows a lot. There's also some dark irony in Nikki saying outside of the bar that all she wants to do is go home, and then she never gets to do so. The wish happens right as she's about to, but after the wish, she insists on going back to Bear's apartment instead. That little detail alone is one of the earliest indications that this isn't the real Nikki anymore. Her behaviors and wants are completely altered on a dime, and there's just no way that Bear doesn't realize that and put two and two together. Which leads to one of the biggest debates around the film: at which point does Bear truly become the villain? I'm pretty firm on this. I don't think Bear becomes corrupted just because of the wish. I think the wish simply reveals who he already was. Throughout the film, his horrible actions continue to escalate, but they're not random changes in character. They're extensions of the same flaws we see from the very beginning. Bear was never truly in love with Nikki. He was obsessed with the idea of her. He was infatuated with what she represented, and the fact that so quickly after the wish he is willing to accept an artificial version or shell of Nikki proves that what he wanted was never really her. He just wanted the idea of her, as we see he was later willing to settle for that. But now, while I think those traits were always there, I think Bear becomes the true villain of the film on the night that he makes the wish. Obviously, the wish is cursed, as you should never involve someone else's feelings or autonomy in your own wish, but even if you argued that Bear thought the willow was clearly fake, and it was just a poor private thing he said in a moment of frustration, not intending or actually wanting it to have any real effect, that argument may work for someone else, but not for Bear, because he clearly and quickly proves to be okay with the effects of this type of cursed wish as long as it doesn't harm him. Plus, the very second Bear has any inkling of suspicion that the wish worked, it's now fully his responsibility to do something about it and definitely not take advantage of it, which he does. I just think there's no way he doesn't realize something is notably wrong or up when Nikki's behavior changes so drastically outside of his car. At the absolute worst, if he doesn't believe the wish affected her, then it would have to be drugs or like a severe mental health crisis, but I think deep down, he knew that the wish worked at that moment. The interesting thing is that the film actually establishes early on that Bear's the type to verbally show care or concern about consent and not taking advantage of people. He repeatedly apologizes to others, like the lady at the diner,
Yeah,
I'm sorry I made you do that.
And is adamant in making sure that no one thinks he's taking advantage of Nikki or crossing a line. But those words ring hollow as they completely contradict his actions throughout the film. And I think that contradiction connects back to one of the film's biggest themes of perception and illusion. Bear doesn't necessarily care about being a good person, he cares about being perceived as one. This often applies to the stereotypical nice guy archetype. A lot of the time, desiring the image of being kind and harmless can actually be driven by ego and personal gain that comes with it, not actual genuine care or selflessness. And Bear's fatal flaw of passivity comes from that same place. It isn't just fear, it's also pride and ego, contributing to his intense fear of rejection. And this is all why the bedroom scene after the wish is so important. Bear lets Nikki into his bed and they begin kissing. The only reason he stops is when Nikki briefly snaps out of the spell and becomes confused. Bear's immediate reaction is defensive. He says she kissed him first, almost as if he's more concerned with proving he didn't do anything wrong than actually recognizing and processing what is happening. And that's the key difference. I don't think Bear is scared because he suddenly realizes he might have violated Nikki's autonomy. I think he's scared because he knew what he was doing and for a second thought he might have been caught by Nikki. The normal Nikki that he knows would never do this. He knows something about Nikki has changed, he knows this isn't normal, but still kisses her and was very likely to do more had the real Nikki not shown up for a second, as he's fine with taking advantage of Nikki in the situation as long as he feels he has some level of plausible deniability. And so also, later at the restaurant, when Ian tells Bear that Nikki lied about her father dying, and also that she told Sarah that she didn't actually like him, I don't think Bear's fear comes from this being the big moment he realizes the spell worked. I think he already knew long before then. Instead, I think that what scares him in that moment is that 1, this new Nikki is unpredictable and potentially dangerous, and 2, that the other people are starting to notice something is seriously wrong with Nikki, and therefore Bear's perception of being the harmless nice guy is beginning to fall apart, as this would clearly look like he is knowingly taking advantage of her. So overall, I don't think Bear was ever a true nice guy or even a blank slate at any point in the film. Not to say that someone like Bear was irredeemable pre-wish, had he done the work and therapy to self-improve, as I think it's really important to still encourage that for people struggling or in his shoes, but unfortunately, therapy or Nathan Fielder's The Rehearsal weren't present in this story, and so I think Bear was always bad and cemented himself as the true villain of the film by the end of Act 1. Earlier, I mentioned how during Bear's rehearsal at the diner, he tells placeholder Nikki, "I would choose you over everything," and that line becomes especially important when compared to the wish he later makes. He wants Nikki to love him more than anything in the world. In a way, Bear is literally wishing for someone to love him the same way that he believes he loves her. But that's the problem, what he feels isn't love, it's obsession. While your significant other should be the most important person in your life, a healthy relationship still requires both people to maintain their own identity and ability to put focus elsewhere. You can't completely lose yourself in another person, because sometimes you still have to choose yourself over them, not out of selfishness, but because independence and individuality are necessary parts of genuine love and sanity. And I think Nikki's moment with the homeless woman outside of the bar perfectly represents what Bear takes away from her. Before the wish, Nikki is someone who chooses to care about other people. Even in a moment where she could simply stay with her friends, she takes the time to help a stranger. That ability to make her own choices and direct her compassion wherever she wants is a part of who she is. And after the wish, that just completely disappears. The new Nikki's entire existence revolves around Bear. Her only purpose is loving him. But ironically, the way she loves him isn't really love at all. It's the same distorted version of love that Bear has shown throughout the film. Obsession, possession, and desperation disguised as affection. In that way, the new Nikki becomes a reflection of Bear. Another thing I also loved were some of the visual choices immediately after the wish. When Nikki and Bear are lying in bed together, Nikki is brightly lit while Bear is surrounded by darkness and gray tones. And I feel like this directly mirrors the earlier scene where Bear was grieving in his bedroom with Nikki on his phone being the only source of light. Also, one of my favorite choices in the film is that Nikki doesn't completely disappear after the wish. I love the choice of having Nikki briefly breaking out of the spell every now and then freaking out. It adds this layer of unpredictability and suspense, and also makes you feel even more fear for whatever the real Nikki is currently going through. And I think her breaking out of the spell when they start kissing that night, or just in general, feels like a unique way to resemble SA and that fearful state of inconsistent consciousness that a victim may have during it. And also the realistic aspect to how it's often a friend, not a stranger, that ends up being the one to do something like this. Also, after this point, I like how we stop seeing Nikki as this light, but the new Nikki is often shrouded in darkness, sometimes so much that she appears more like a shadow or a silhouette rather than an actual person, which I think is a cool way to highlight the loss of her personhood and autonomy. She's just now like this shell of her old self, or rock even, and that light or sunshine is somewhere captive and hidden in that rock. Also, later when Nikki shows back up to Bear's house the first night after the wish, I definitely peeped how she's wearing a red dress, consistent with the red symbolizing that love mixed with aggression, which the new Nikki definitely embodies. And then it's also of note that at the beginning, we saw how much Nikki would tease and take jabs as a part of her natural banter. She definitely wasn't this docile personality type like we see with the new Nikki, never taking any playful jabs and only just catering to Bear. So the fact that this notable personality trait of hers was just completely absent for however long that montage was of them being together just shows how much Bear had to have realized that Nikki wasn't the same one before the wish, and he was completely content with that and the new Nikki as long as she wasn't causing notable problems for him. I think the restaurant scene contains some of the clearest evidence of what Bear is missing and also who he ultimately chooses to become. The first thing that stood out to me was the tiger's eye stone that Nikki gave to Bear. She tells him that it's supposed to bring confidence and willpower, which are basically the two things that Bear lacks most, and they feel like the qualities that could have honestly helped avoid almost every problem in this film. If Bear had the confidence to be vulnerable and the willpower to accept whatever answer Nikki gave him, none of this would have ever happened. I also found it interesting that a tiger is another form of cat, connecting back to the film's recurring cat symbolism. But unlike Sandy or the house cat imagery we've seen throughout the film, a tiger represents something completely different. A house cat is small, domesticated, and often associated with companionship. A tiger is powerful, independent, and exists on its own terms. Also, unlike a domesticated house cat, a tiger is wild, free, and has its own autonomy. And so it's also interesting that Nikki is the one giving him this symbol of independence and autonomy, because that's ultimately the qualities that he took from her. And they're also the qualities Bear will most need to save Nikki and reverse the wish later in the film, which he fails to do. And in this scene, Ian tells Bear that Nikki told Sarah she views Bear like a little brother. On the surface, this seems like the clearest confirmation that Nikki wasn't interested in Bear romantically, but I actually don't think that alone is the strongest evidence. Nikki herself says earlier that if she liked someone, nobody would ever know, and that would include Sarah. It's also possible that she didn't want to complicate things with Sarah, knowing that Sarah had feelings for Bear. However, the specific wording of little brother is the much more interesting part, and I think the detail that becomes far more telling later. I also noticed a couple little similarities or possible nods to the film Get Out in this movie, and the moment where Nikki gets up and does the whole no thing feels like a straight pull from that iconic scene from Get Out. And I wonder if just like in Get Out, that initial creepy no is the entity Nikki forcing the real Nikki back down who is trying to break out. Plus, when writing this, I literally just realized that the title Get Out isn't just like the literal meaning of get out of the house or situation. It also could work as a triple entendre to show how they're trapped inside their own bodies and need to find a way to get out, and also how it could be them saying get out to the people that have taken control and occupied their bodies. One of my favorite movies of all time, and my first time ever really noticing that. But I think at the end of this scene, when Bear confronts Nikki over the lie about her dad, and she basically questions why it even matters if Bear's happy now, and Bear responds by saying,
Doesn't matter to me.
It's just the clearest and most straightforward reveal of his character. He knows for sure that she's not fully in her right mind, and even that his friends know this as well, and he's essentially saying that none of that matters to him as long as he still gets what he wants. Just complete selfishness and violation. And that's emphasized by the film immediately cutting to them having sex after. This scene is basically just full SA. It depicts Bear having his way with her while she's just lying there for his pleasure, and she feels less like an actual participant and more just like a body or sex doll. It doesn't feel like an act being done by two people, but by one, as there doesn't appear to be any care about her pleasure or whether she's actually enjoying it. And then his face afterwards says it all. There's a brief moment where it feels like he knows exactly what he's done and what he's continuing to do, but still plans to take advantage of the situation as he's finally getting what he wanted. After the restaurant scene, I think the film continues showing how the possessed version of Nikki is essentially a heightened reflection of Bear's own behavior. The entity isn't just becoming some random monster, it's taking the unhealthy qualities that already existed in Bear and exaggerating them. For example, we previously saw Bear obsessively look through Nikki's Instagram, watching her from a distance instead of actually communicating with her. Later, Nikki does something similar by sitting in the corner and watching Bear sleep. When Nikki begs Bear to stay in the bed and not leave, I think that could also reflect something Bear has already done to her. Before the wish, Nikki wanted to move on, she wanted to leave her job and potentially potentially leave town. But Bear's desire and wish to have her stay with him ultimately prevents that from happening. And the most obvious parallel is Nikki taping the door shut. Bear has literally trapped the real Nikki inside of her own body in order to keep the relationship he wanted. So when the entity physically traps Bear, it feels like a twisted reflection of what he has already done to her. I also think the way Nikki behaves when Bear leaves for work is another interesting layer to the cat symbolism. She spends the entire day waiting by the door for him to return, and the second he does, she's right there waiting for him. And it feels almost like a pet waiting for its owner to come home. Even her defecating on the carpet while he's gone has that same pet-like behavior. But the darker implication is that I don't think Bear's problem is that Nikki is behaving like a pet. His problem is that she's behaving like an untrained pet. And the dark thing is, I think he'd be okay with it if he could have her in this state as a trained pet. As throughout the film, the way he interacts with her is almost like he's disciplining her and trying to alter her to act the way he wants, like training a pet. This issue for him doesn't come from the fact that she's treated like a pet, he just has issues with the fact that she's untrained and still difficult to fully domesticate. When it comes to the phone call, it's just another display of Bear's true evilness when he first asks the customer support if there's any way that he can alter the wish, not cancel it, confirming that idea that he is okay with having Nikki as a pet, just wants her to act like a trained one. Also, being able to hear the real Nikki screams were extremely haunting and disturbing, so the fact that he still seems so okay with keeping her in this state just really pushes him from like a bad guy villain to like true next level evil in my opinion. I mean, that was some psychopath behavior the way he responded following hearing her. But I do also really love the stakes that are set up here and how the only options he's presented with to end the wish is either him dying or Nikki dying. This is truly super intense and a lot to process, but the way he just hangs up the phone and keeps it pushing, even going to the party after, is just insane. When it comes to the party scene, I actually think this contains the strongest evidence that Nikki was never romantically interested in Bear. During the game they're playing, Nikki recites a passage about incest between a brother and sister during her turn, and that definitely feels like a callback to how Sarah told Ian Nikki saw Bear as a little brother. And if that is what the film is referencing, then it gives the passage an even more disturbing meaning, that Nikki is now being forced into a romantic relationship with someone she may have genuinely viewed as family, making this entire experience feel even more deeply wrong and violating. Another detail that stood out to me is that the passage begins by describing the brother's face as being obscured. And earlier in the film, Bear's face is literally obscured in the blurry mirror at the shop. That parallel may not be intentional, but it definitely did catch my attention. But we also never find out what Nikki originally read before deciding to recite that passage, so it's still hard to have a definitive answer to all of this. But I do just feel like that excerpt somehow came from the real Nikki and not the new entity Nikki. Not sure how that would work though. A little later, the real Nikki regains consciousness again and immediately begins trying to kill herself. It's an incredibly disturbing scene because it reveals just how unbearable her existence has become. The first thing she does after regaining control isn't ask for help, but instead just tries to violently end her own life. And the words she uses here are, which were the exact words written on the Polaroid that Nikki gave Bear in his lunch earlier. To me, this feels like the confirmation that those messages were really coming from the real Nikki, desperately trying to let someone know that her body's been possessed and that she needs saving. But once again, Bear's response is astonishing. Even after everything he's witnessed, he still fails to meaningfully act, and somehow he gets even worse. When they return home after the party, Bear complains that everything was normal and that everything was good until Nikki made a scene. That line is honestly one of the clearest windows into Bear's mindset. By this point, he knows exactly what's happening. He's heard Nikki screaming during the customer support call. He's watched her repeatedly regain consciousness and freak out or even try to kill herself, and yet his frustration isn't that Nikki is suffering. His frustration is that she interrupted the fantasy. And he's still desperately searching for reassurance that Nikki really loves him, even though it's already become painfully obvious that he's not going to get a real authentic answer from this new Nikki. And I think that's why another line that really stood out to me was when Bear begs the entity to just be Nikki. He isn't really asking for the real Nikki to come back, he's just asking for the new entity to do a better impression of her. Because at this point, Bear doesn't actually need the real Nikki herself, he just needs something convincing enough in order for him to maintain the illusion. The monologue where Nikki describes lying in bed alone and feeling nothing, not darkness, but nothing, feels like it's describing what the real Nikki experiences while trapped inside her own body. It's such a haunting way to describe the loss of autonomy. She isn't describing physical pain, she's describing complete emptiness. And I think that's an important distinction because the film keeps coming back to the idea that there are fates worse than pain or even death. Sometimes numbness, helplessness, and the complete loss of autonomy can be even more horrifying. Later, when the real Nikki is finally able to speak to Bear while the entity is asleep, we get one of the most heartbreaking and infuriating scenes in the entire movie. Nikki begs Bear to kill her, and Bear's response is,
So bad about being with me.
to me, that's the moment that completely cements Bear as one of the most hateable horror villains in recent memory. Even after everything that's happened, after hearing Nikki scream, after watching her beg for death, after seeing her repeatedly fight to regain control of her body, his first concern is still his own feelings. It's an unbelievable level of selfishness. And Nikki's reply,
I've never been with you, Bear.
is just a great, chilling response. Personally, I think this is the moment where Bear really just needs to commit to taking his own life. At this point, it's either him or her, and it's his fault that they're in this mess. And also, there wouldn't be any murder charges or legal trouble to deal with as of now with that result. But even if he couldn't bring himself to do that, then he should have at least respected Nikki's own choice and honored that request she was making. But Bear does neither, because once again, his fatal flaw is fear and passivity. And more importantly, he still doesn't truly value Nikki's choice and autonomy. Even now, when she clearly tells him what she wants, he refuses to give her that choice because it requires sacrificing something himself. And on top of that, rather than doing the right thing, Bear decides to put even more people in danger by going out to the car to meet up with Sarah. I was pissed off the second he made that decision because I immediately saw where it was going. It was just so reckless to meet up with Sarah at this point and basically cheat, knowing how dangerous and unstable Nikki is. So when it goes exactly how I expected and Nikki kills Sarah and then tells Bear that it was kinda his fault, I honestly couldn't agree more. I'd just leave out the kinda. It's ultimately Bear's obsession and unhealthy bond with Nikki that ruined the future for not only himself, but also for Sarah. So the moment that could have been great in another timeline where both of their futures were laid out and hopeful with Sarah getting into college and then possibly ending up together is physically and symbolically taken away by this artificial idea of Nikki that Bear has created. In the final scene back at the house, I love the creepy touches of Nikki basically turning herself into Sarah after becoming jealous of her relationship with Bear. She draws Sarah's exact tattoos on her body, wears her clothes, and even wears her scalped hair. It's just super disturbing, but also works really well as a solid external metaphor for how people can completely become someone else to fit what they believe their partner wants. It's just another unique way that the film explores someone losing their autonomy in a relationship. And toward the end, Bear finally builds up the courage to take his own life. Far too late though, as Sarah and Ian have already died at this point. But I did catch Bear looking at the Tiger's Eye stone before making that decision, as it represents the strength and willpower that he ultimately needs to go through with it. And yet, even after swallowing the pills, he's still too cowardly to fully commit, as he immediately tries to throw them back up, backing out once again. But he's unable to because Nikki does use the One Wish Willow on him. And so Bear dies from overdosing on the pills and ends up lying dead on the floor of his house, just like his cat at the beginning of the film, completing that full circle symbolism of his and the cat's doom-ticking clock. And really, all of Team Sandy comes full circle too, as the entire friend group ends up back in that house, 3 of them dead, with Nikki left in horrible shape. And it's crazy how all of this could have been avoided if Bear had just faced his fear and vulnerability. If he had been willing to sit with a little discomfort and possible rejection with expressing his feelings to Nikki, he could have gotten to the other side of what he actually wanted and needed. That's why I found it so interesting that Bear dies specifically from painkillers, something that's meant for you to avoid pain so you don't have to feel it. Because that's exactly what Bear spends the entire film trying to do emotionally. And then he literally overdoses on it, literally and metaphorically. He never overcomes his fatal flaw of avoiding pain, vulnerability, and rejection. He just lets it consume him. And that's why this ending is definitely a tragedy. Bear leaves Nikki behind in those horrible circumstances, which is just one more grand final selfish act from him. And it's interesting how the villain ultimately dies and the victim gets to live, which would usually make for a happy ending, but not this time. Calling back to the idea that sometimes people can truly be subjected to fates worse than death. And unfortunately, Nikki is forced to live one of those fates.